November of 1874 came down hard on the high country of the Wind River Basin, and it came earlier than any old rancher in Sweetwater County could remember. The willows along the creek beds had already gone black with frost by the third week of October, and the geese had pushed south a full month ahead of their usual pattern. In the little settlement of Claiborne Bend, tucked between two ridges of red sandstone, men were nailing extra planks across barn doors and stacking cordwood higher than they had ever bothered to stack it before. Something about the air that autumn felt wrong to the older men in the valley. The dogs slept closer to the stoves than they should have. Horses stood restless in their paddocks after sundown, and the smoke rising from the chimneys of Claiborne Bend seemed to climb straighter and colder than it did in ordinary years. But up on the flat above the bend, where the timber thinned and the wind ran clean off the western slope, Silas Thorne was doing something else entirely. He was digging holes. He had been digging them since the last week of September, working alone with a long-handled spade and a mattock and a wheelbarrow that had lost one iron rim 2 winters back. Each pit went down about 3 feet, no wider than a wagon axle at the top, and each one lay in a careful line running the length of what would soon be the floor of his half-finished cabin. His neighbor, a lean cattleman named Harlan Voss, rode up one cold morning to watch him work and said nothing for nearly 10 minutes. Then he leaned across his saddle horn and asked the question every man in Claiborne Bend would eventually ask him. "You planning to bury something down there, Silas?" Silas straightened his back slowly. 41 years old, wide across the shoulders, a face weathered enough to look 10 years older than his birthday claimed. He set the spade against the pile of dirt beside the hole and looked up at Harlan without answering right away. "Stones," he said finally. Harlan waited for the rest. When nothing came, he shifted his weight in the saddle and pushed his hat back an inch. "Stones. Hot ones." That was all Silas said before picking up the spade again. Harlan sat there another half-minute watching him work. Then he turned the horse without another word and rode down the ridge trail toward town. By supper that evening, every man drinking coffee at the Broken Wheel Saloon had heard about it. By the next morning, half the women at the general store were laughing quietly behind their sleeves. And by the end of the week, the phrase Thorne's stone graves had begun to travel through Claiborne Bend the way most bad jokes travel through small mountain towns, quietly at first, then louder, then everywhere at once. Silas Thorne heard the mockery same as everyone else. He heard it when he brought his mule down to the blacksmith for shoeing. He heard it when he stopped at Miss Verity Osgood's post counter to collect a letter from his sister back in Ohio. He heard it once from a group of boys throwing rocks near the creek who fell dead silent the instant he turned his head toward them. He never argued with any of it. He never explained. He simply paid his bills, tipped his hat where a tip was owed, and rode back up the ridge trail to keep digging. His daughter Adeline was 9 years old that autumn, dark-haired, thin through the shoulders in a way that always worried him, and quiet the way a child gets quiet after her mother dies. Nell Thorne had been gone 3 winters now. Pneumonia had taken her in the spring following the collapse of the mine at Red Fork, back when the family still lived down in the lowlands. Silas had brought Adeline up to the high country the following summer, homesteaded 160 acres along the ridge above Claiborne Bend, and set to building a cabin the way a man builds a promise he has made only to himself. But the cabin he was building did not look like other cabins in Sweetwater County. The walls were going up slower than any neighbor could understand. The floor was not planked yet, and beneath the ground where the floor would eventually sit, a row of dark pits waited quietly for the stones Silas Thorne had already begun gathering along the creek bed a mile below the ridge. The stones Silas gathered were not ordinary river stones. He rode down to the creek bed every third morning that October, leading his old mule up the wash, while Adeline sat quietly on the animal's back holding the lead rope. He had taught her to watch the creek bank for the dark ones, the heavy ones, the stones that felt warm even when the water running around them ran cold. Basalt, he called them, though he never used the word around the men in town. He called them river iron when other people asked, and let them think whatever they wanted to think about a widower who spent his mornings loading rocks onto a mule instead of splitting cordwood like every other homesteader on the ridge. Adeline learned quickly which stones her father wanted. She would point to them with a small mittened hand, and Silas would wade into the shallows in his high leather boots to pry them loose from the gravel. Each stone came out darker than the granite chips lying beside it, dense and smooth, some of them nearly round from 1,000 years of being rolled through spring flood water. He tested each one by lifting it and knocking it lightly against another. If it rang clean, he kept it. If it sounded dull, he left it in the water. By the middle of October, he had gathered close to 40 of them along the ridge above the cabin site, stacked in 3 neat piles beside the pits he had dug. Harlan Voss rode by again one afternoon and stopped without dismounting. "Silas, I ain't a man who tells another man his business," Harlan said carefully, "but there's cattle folks down in the bend saying you've lost your senses up here, and I can see the winter coming in same as you can. That cabin ain't half framed. Your daughter's going to freeze up here before Thanksgiving if you don't put a roof on it soon." Silas straightened from the pit he was measuring. He wiped his forehead with the back of his glove and looked at Harlan for a long moment. "Roof goes on after the floor," he said. "Floor goes on after the stones. That's the order of it." "That ain't the order of anything, Silas. It is the way I'm building it." Harlan looked down at the pits, then at the piles of dark stones, then at the small figure of Adeline sitting on the porch step of the tool shed wrapped in a wool blanket watching them both. He rubbed the back of his neck slowly. "You got kin down in Ohio, don't you? Your sister sends you letters. Maybe you ought to think about sending the girl to her for the season, just till spring. Ain't no shame in it." Silas said nothing for a moment, then he shook his head once slowly. "Nell's buried up here, Harlan. Adeline ain't leaving her mother behind again, not for a season, not for a winter, not for anything." He picked up the spade. "The cabin will hold, you'll see." Harlan turned his horse without pressing further. That evening he stopped at the broken wheel and told 2 other men what he had seen, and by morning the story had grown into something worse than what he had actually said. By the following Sunday, Pastor Odo Crane mentioned during the sermon the danger of pride in a man who would not accept help from his neighbors, and though he never used Silas Thorne's name aloud, every soul in the little clapboard church knew exactly who he meant. Silas did not attend that Sunday. He was up on the ridge fitting the last of the pit linings into place, working with a careful precision that would have surprised any man who watched him do it. He had cut flat slabs of shale from an outcropping a quarter-mile east of the cabin, hauled them up one at a time by hand sled, and now he was fitting them along the walls and the bottoms of each pit so that the earth around the stones would not draw the heat away too quickly. Between the shale and the raw dirt behind it, he packed a thick layer of dry wood ash he had been saving in barrels for months, all the way back to the previous summer. Adeline watched from the porch step, her chin tucked into the collar of her wool coat. "Pa," she said quietly, "are they laughing at you again in town?" Silas fitted another slab into place. He did not look up. "Yes," he said. "Does it hurt?" He was quiet a long time before he answered. "No, girl. Not the way it used to." The idea had not come to Silas Thorne in a single moment. It had come to him slowly, over years, the way most hard-won knowledge comes to a man who has already lost too much to trust the easy answers. He had first seen the principle at work as a boy of 11, back in the hill country of southern Ohio, where his father had run a small tannery along the banks of a creek that froze solid every January. His grandfather, an old Welshman named Owen Thorne, had lived in a stone-walled cottage built into the side of a hill, and Silas remembered the first time he had spent a winter night beneath that low sod roof. The fire in the hearth had burned small, no larger than a man's 2 hands cupped together, and yet the cottage had held warmth through the whole of the night. His grandfather had shown him the reason in the morning. Beneath the floor of the cottage, buried in a shallow pit lined with slate and clay, sat a mass of dark stones the old man had heated by fire twice a day. The stones released their warmth slowly through the floor, hour after hour, long after the fire itself had died down to nothing but embers. Rocks remember the fire longer than the fire remembers itself, his grandfather had said in that thick Welsh accent Silas could still hear in his memory. A wise man learns to trust what stays warm after the flame has gone. Silas had never forgotten those words, but he had also never had reason to think of them again for nearly 30 years. He had worked timber in Michigan. He had worked the mines at Red Fork. He had built a plank cabin down in the lowlands the way every other frontier man built one, with green pine walls and a cast-iron stove that ate cordwood faster than a man could split it. And that cabin had killed his wife. Nell had not died of pneumonia because the fire went out. She had died of pneumonia because the fire could never quite keep up with the cold that leaked through the walls, the floor, the seams around the door, the whistling gaps beneath the eaves. He remembered lying beside her the last week of her life, feeding the stove every 2 hours through the night, and still watching her shiver beneath 3 quilts. The stove had roared. The room had never truly warmed. And when she died at dawn on the 5th day of April, the coffee pot on the stove had still been hot enough to burn a man's hand, while the water in the wash basin 4 feet away had frozen a skin of ice across the top. That was the moment Silas Thorne had begun to remember his grandfather's stone floor. He had spent the following 2 winters reading everything he could find on the subject. He had ordered a book from a bookseller in Cincinnati about Roman hypocausts, the ancient underfloor heating systems the emperors had used to warm their bathhouses. He had spoken to a German blacksmith down in Laramie who described the tile stoves of the Bavarian mountains, great masses of ceramic and stone that held heat for 12 hours from a single small fire. He had traded correspondence with a Norwegian settler in Minnesota who wrote in careful English about the soapstone hearths his grandfather had built into the walls of the family farmhouse across the sea. Every one of these methods worked on the same principle: store the heat in something dense enough to hold it, release it slowly, over hours, into the space where people slept. By the spring of 1874, Silas Thorne had made his decision. He would not build another timber cabin heated by a hungry stove. He would build a cabin with a floor of buried stones, a hearth designed to warm those stones twice a day, and walls thick enough to keep the mountain from stealing back what the fire had put into the ground. He had explained none of this to anyone in Claiborne Bend, not to Harlan Voss, not to the pastor, not to Miss Verity at the post counter. He had learned over the course of his life that men in small towns did not much care for other men who claimed to know something they themselves did not know. And so he had simply begun digging, one pit at a time, and had let the valley below say whatever it wished to say. By the last week of October, the first hard frost had crusted the ground above the ridge, and Silas Thorne was working against a deadline no man in the valley below could see coming. He rose before dawn each morning to light a small fire beneath a canvas tarp he had rigged over the cabin site, thawing the earth just enough to keep digging. Adeline brought him coffee in a tin cup at first light, wrapped in 3 layers of wool and mittens her father had sewn himself out of an old buffalo hide. She sat on a folded blanket beside the tool shed and watched him work while the sky above the eastern ridge turned from black to purple to the pale gray of a mountain morning. The pits were finished now, 11 of them in total, arranged in 2 parallel rows running the length of what would become the main room of the cabin. Each pit lay a little less than 3 feet deep and was lined with fitted shale slabs, packed dry ash, and a thin bed of coarse river sand at the bottom to allow moisture to drain without freezing. Above each pit, Silas had built a small iron frame from stock he had hammered flat himself at the blacksmith's forge down in Claiborne Bend, paying for the forge time by shoeing 3 of the blacksmith's own horses in trade. The frame sat about a hand's width above the stones themselves and would support the flooring planks once the stones were placed. The stones came next. Silas rolled them one at a time up the ridge from the stack beside the tool shed, using a short wooden ramp and a length of hemp rope tied around each stone in a hitch his grandfather had taught him. He lowered each one carefully into its pit and packed the space around it with more dry ash and small chips of shale, leaving only the top surface of the stone exposed to the air within the pit itself. When he was finished, the 11 pits held 44 stones in total, 4 to a pit, each stone weighing between 30 and 50 pounds. Beside the pits, along the north wall of the cabin, he built the hearth. The hearth was the heart of the whole system, and Silas had thought about it longer than he had thought about anything else in his life, except perhaps the day he had asked Nell to marry him. It was not an ordinary fireplace. It sat only 2 feet high, no taller than a low bench, and it opened toward the room with a wide iron door he had traded 3 days of split fencing for. Behind the door, a chamber of fire brick surrounded by another layer of shale ran back into a channel that curved beneath the floor itself. The fire, when lit, would burn hot within the fire brick chamber. The smoke and the heat, drawn by the draft, would travel through a stone channel that passed directly beneath each of the 11 pits before rising up a chimney set into the north wall. In doing so, the heat would pass across the exposed tops of the buried stones twice each day, morning and evening, and the stones would store that heat and release it slowly upward through the flooring planks for the 16 or 18 hours between fires. It was the same principle his grandfather had used in Wales. It was the same principle the Romans had used 2,000 years earlier. It was the same principle the Bavarian tile stoves and the Norwegian soapstone hearths and the Korean ondal floors had all used for centuries in cold countries where firewood was too precious to burn carelessly. But no one in Claiborne Bend had ever seen such a thing, and no one in Claiborne Bend was going to understand what he was building until they saw it hold heat with their own eyes. Adeline watched him lay the last of the fire brick one gray afternoon in the first week of November. She had a wool scarf pulled up over her nose and mouth, and only her dark eyes showed above the fabric. "Pa," she said through the scarf, "when will we sleep in it?" Silas set his trowel down and looked at the walls, still not quite closed at the top, still open to the sky where the roof beams had yet to be raised. "Soon, Adeline," he said quietly, "before the snow comes deep. I promise you that." She nodded once and went back to watching him work. The roof went up in the second week of November, and it went up faster than any man in the valley had a right to expect. Silas worked from before first light until he could no longer see the head of his hammer against the darkening sky, and he worked alone. Not one man from Claiborne Bend rode up to offer a hand. Not one. Word had spread far enough by then that helping Silas Thorne was viewed the way helping a man dig his own grave was viewed, an act better refused than encouraged, out of respect for whatever grief had driven him mad. Only Miss Verity Osgood, the widow who ran the post counter at the general store, ever mentioned him kindly in mixed company. She was a small woman of 52 with steel-gray hair pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to hold her whole face still, and she had lost her own husband to the same mine collapse at Red Fork that had ruined so many families in the region. She remembered Nell Thorne from before, remembered the quiet way Nell had spoken of her husband's careful hands and his patient mind, and Verity had never once believed that Silas Thorne was a man who had lost his senses. She said as much to Pastor Crane one Sunday after service, standing on the church steps with her gloved hands folded in front of her. "That man is not a fool, Pastor," she said quietly. "He may be many things, but he is not that. And the child is with him alone up on that ridge. If anything happens to her before the winter is done, I do not want to be counted among those who did nothing." The pastor had nodded politely and said something about faith and providence and moved on to the next parishioner. But Verity had gone home that afternoon and packed a small basket with dried apples, a jar of honey, a bundle of tallow candles, and a half-pound of good black tea, and she had asked the boy who swept out the store on Saturdays to carry the basket up the ridge to the Thorne cabin. The boy came back an hour later with the basket still full, and a note written on the back of a torn scrap of butcher paper in Silas Thorne's careful hand. "Ma'am, my daughter and I have all we need for the season. Your kindness is remembered but not required. S. Thorne." Verity read the note twice, folded it, and placed it in the small tin box on her mantelpiece where she kept the few letters her husband had written her before the collapse. Then she packed a second basket the following week and sent it up again. This time she did not include a note. This time the basket came back empty. Up on the ridge, Silas was fitting the flooring planks. Each plank was 8 feet long. Cut from close-grained fir he had hauled up the mountain over the course of the previous summer, planed by hand until they were smooth on both sides, and drilled with small ventilation holes every 18 inches along the length of the board. The holes were the width of a woman's thumb, and they were positioned directly above the buried stones, allowing warm air to rise gently from the pits and into the room above. He fitted each plank into place with wooden pegs rather than iron nails, because iron would carry cold up through the floor and defeat the purpose of everything he had built beneath it. Adeline helped him where she could. She held the ends of the planks steady while he drove the pegs. She fetched the wooden mallet when he set it down out of reach. She swept the shavings from between the boards with a small broom of stiff grass her father had bundled for her that morning. And when the last plank was fitted into place late on the afternoon of November 13th, she stood on the finished floor in her wool stockings and stamped her small foot twice and looked up at her father with something close to a smile. "It sounds different, Pa," she said. Silas set his mallet on the workbench and looked at her. "Different how, girl?" "Softer, like it is holding something." He nodded slowly. He had not expected her to notice such a thing, but children often heard what grown men had trained themselves to ignore. "That is exactly what it is doing, Adeline," he said. "You have good ears." That night they lit the first fire in the new hearth. Silas built that first fire small, smaller than any man in the valley would have thought reasonable for the size of the room around it. He laid a bed of dry pine shavings beneath a careful lattice of split cedar no thicker than a man's finger, and above that he placed 3 modest lengths of well-seasoned lodgepole he had been drying beneath a canvas tarp since August. When the flame caught and began to climb, he closed the iron door of the hearth almost all the way, leaving only a narrow gap at the bottom for the draft to pull air across the coals. Adeline stood beside him, watching the fire through the small glass window set into the door. She had never seen a fireplace built the way this one was built, low and wide and enclosed like the belly of a stove, and she watched the flames curl backward into the stone channel behind the firebrick with wide, dark eyes. "Where does the smoke go, Pa?" "Beneath the floor," he said quietly. "It runs the whole length of the room, all the way to the north wall, and then it climbs up the chimney and out. And the stones. The stones drink the heat as it passes over them. They will hold it through the night." She thought about that for a moment. "Like a horse drinks from the creek," he almost smiled. "Yes, girl, something like that." They sat together on the edge of the low wooden bench Silas had built beside the hearth, and for the first hour the room warmed slowly, almost imperceptibly, in a way that would have alarmed any man used to the roaring blast of a cast-iron stove. The air did not grow suddenly hot. It grew steadily comfortable. The chill lifted from the corners of the room the way morning fog lifts from a river valley, evenly, without hurry. By the second hour, Adeline had removed her outer wool coat. By the third, she had removed her mittens as well, and Silas had noticed her stretch her small stockinged feet toward the floorboards and wiggle her toes against the wood. "It is warm from below, Pa," she said with something like wonder in her voice. "Yes. The floor is warm. Yes." She was quiet a long time after that. Then she looked up at him with the careful, serious expression she had inherited from her mother. "Ma would have liked this floor." Silas did not answer for a long moment. He watched the fire behind the iron door and let the ache in his chest pass through him the way he had learned to let it pass, without fighting it, without pretending it was not there. "Yes, Adeline," he said finally. "She would have." He let the fire burn for 4 hours that first night, feeding it 3 more small pieces of lodgepole at careful intervals, watching the temperature of the room rise slowly to something near 70 degrees, despite the fact that the wind outside had dropped to 15 degrees above zero. When the last piece of wood had burned down to coals, he closed the iron door completely and shut the small brass draft lever he had fitted along the base. The fire would suffocate itself into a slow bank of glowing embers by midnight. The stones beneath the floor would continue to radiate heat upward for the next 14 hours without any further fuel at all. He laid a pallet for Adeline directly on the floorboards beside the hearth that night, with 2 wool blankets beneath her and 1 on top. He himself slept on a bedroll a few feet away, closer to the door, his rifle within reach the way a frontier man's rifle always was. The old brown dog he had taken in the previous summer, a rangy hound named Josiah, curled himself against the small of Adeline's back and did not once shiver through the whole of the night. Silas woke twice before dawn to check the room. Both times, the floor beneath his hand was still warm. Both times, the air in the cabin was still steady. Both times, Adeline slept without stirring, her face relaxed in the way it had not been relaxed since her mother had died. At sunrise, he stepped outside to gather more wood from the stack beneath the eave and stopped at the doorway. The temperature had dropped through the night. Frost coated the fence rails a hand's thickness deep. His breath rose in a white column against the pale sky. Behind him in the cabin, his daughter slept warm. He stood there a long time before he went back inside. The mockery in Claiborne Bend grew louder in the weeks that followed, not quieter, and Silas Thorne came to understand something he had suspected but never fully accepted before. Men do not laugh hardest at what they believe to be foolish. They laugh hardest at what they cannot understand. And the smoke rising from the low chimney of the Thorne cabin twice a day, morning and evening, and never in between, had begun to trouble the men in the valley in a way they could not put into words. Every other cabin in Sweetwater County sent smoke into the sky from before dawn until well after sundown, a steady gray plume that marked the constant feeding of a cast-iron stove or an open hearth. But the Thorne cabin sent smoke only twice, in short, thick columns that lasted perhaps 2 hours each, and then went silent for the rest of the day. Harlan Voss noticed it first, riding the ridge trail on his way to check a fence line the second week the fires were burning. He stopped his horse 100 yards below the cabin and watched for a long time. The chimney sat cold. The air was 15 degrees, and yet through the small window beside the door he could see Adeline Thorne moving about the room without her coat on. He rode into town that afternoon and told 2 men what he had seen. By the following morning, 5 men had ridden the ridge trail past the Thorne cabin at different hours of the day, each pretending to be about other business, each looking sidelong at the cold chimney and the warm window. By the end of the week, the phrase Thorne stone graves had begun to change in the mouths of the men who used it. It was still spoken with a laugh, but the laugh had grown thinner. Something underneath it had shifted. Pastor Odo Crane was the first man in the valley to say the word aloud that no one else had yet dared to say. He said it standing at the counter of the general store on a Thursday afternoon, buying a tin of pipe tobacco and speaking quietly to Miss Verity Osgood. "Witchery," he said. "That is what it puts me in mind of, Verity. A cabin that holds heat without fire is not natural, and a child kept warm by unnatural means is a child in spiritual danger." Miss Verity did not look up from the ledger she was writing in. She finished the line she was working on, blotted it carefully with her small square of felt, and then raised her eyes to the pastor with an expression so cold that he took an involuntary step back from the counter. "Pastor Crane," she said quietly, "my husband died in a mine collapse 11 years ago and left me with nothing but this counter and a Bible I have read cover to cover more times than you have. And I will tell you this once and never again. If you stand in my store and use the word witchery about a widowed man raising his motherless daughter alone on a mountain, you will not stand in my store a second time. Do I make myself understood?" The pastor stared at her a long moment. His mouth opened once and closed again. He set the tin of pipe tobacco carefully on the counter, paid for it in silence, and left the store without another word. Verity finished her ledger entry with a hand that did not tremble, though she noticed later that afternoon that her tea had gone cold in the cup beside her while she had been writing. That evening she packed a third basket. This one held a book of poetry she had loved as a girl, a small tin of good white sugar, and a paper twist of horehound candy for the child. She sent it up the ridge with a different boy this time, one who was not so easily turned away, and she wrote on the outside of the basket in her precise schoolteacher's hand, "Mr. Thorne, this is not charity, this is neighborliness. If you send it back, I shall send it up again next week and the week after until you understand the difference. V. Osgood." The basket came back the following morning, but it did not come back empty. Inside it sat a small carved wooden bird no larger than a woman's palm, worked in fine detail from a piece of pale cedar. A folded note lay beside it. "Ma'am, my daughter thanks you for the candy. I thank you for the neighborliness. The bird is not payment. It is only a bird. S. Thorn." The storm came on the 3rd day of December, and it came the way the old men in the valley had known it was going to come since October. It came from the northwest, out of the high country beyond the Wind River Range, and it came with a stillness ahead of it that emptied the sky of birds a full day before the first flake fell. Harlan Voss stepped out onto his porch that morning to feed his cattle and stopped halfway down the steps because the air felt wrong on his face in a way he had not felt in 22 years of winters on that land. He turned around, went back inside, and told his wife to bring the children in from the barn and to fill every kettle and washtub they owned with water before the pump froze. By noon, the first snow had begun to fall. By 3 in the afternoon, a man could not see the far side of the corral from the porch of the ranch house. By nightfall, the wind had risen to a scream that rattled the shutters and tore loose a section of the barn roof on the Voss property, and the temperature had fallen to 11 below zero and was still dropping. The storm ran 3 full days without pause. Down in Claiborne Bend, men lost cattle they could not reach through the drifts. A section of the roof of the Broken Wheel Saloon collapsed under the weight of the snow on the second night, and a young ranch hand named Bertram Cole died in the loft above the livery stable, not from cold directly, but from the smoke of a poorly vented stove he had stoked too hard against the deepening freeze. 2 families had to be dug out of their cabins on the 3rd morning by neighbors working with shovels and hand sleds, and one of those families, the Hollisters out on the West Road, lost their youngest child that same night to what the traveling doctor from Rawlins later called lung congestion brought on by prolonged exposure to inadequate warmth. The pastor buried the Hollister child on the 5th day after the storm broke, in ground so frozen the men had to build a fire over the grave site for 6 hours before they could dig it. He stood at the graveside in his black coat with the snow still falling in thin, cold flakes around them, and he spoke about providence and about the mysterious will of God, and the men and women of Claiborne Bend listened with their heads bowed and their hands folded and their minds elsewhere. Because every one of them standing there beside that small pine box was thinking the same thing. Every one of them was thinking about the cabin up on the ridge above the bend, and the widower who lived in it, and the 9-year-old girl who lived in it with him. None of them had ridden up the ridge trail during the storm. The drifts had been too deep, the wind too dangerous, and if a man were to be honest with himself, none of them had truly wanted to know. Because to ride up that trail during those 3 days would have been to face one of 2 things. Either they would have found the cabin buried and cold, and the man and his daughter frozen inside it, which would have confirmed everything the valley had said about Sela's Thorn. Or they would have found something else, and that something else would have meant that every man in Claiborne Bend had been wrong about him for 2 months, and no man in a small mountain town easily admits to being wrong for 2 months about his neighbor. Miss Verity Osgood did not sleep for those 3 nights. She sat in her small parlor above the general store with a shawl around her shoulders and a lamp burning low beside her chair, and she prayed the way a woman prays when there is nothing else left to do. She prayed for the child. She prayed for the father. She prayed with a specificity that would have shocked Pastor Crane if he had heard it, because she prayed by name for a man the pastor had all but accused of witchery. On the morning of the 6th day, the storm broke. The sun rose pale and cold over a valley buried to the 2nd story of most buildings, and Harlan Voss saddled his horse, took a shovel and a coil of rope across the horn of his saddle, and began the slow, hard climb up the ridge trail to see what had become of his neighbor. The ridge trail had ceased to exist. Harlan Voss climbed for 2 full hours through drifts that reached the belly of his horse, and in some places higher, breaking a path he would later have to reopen coming down. He carried a shovel across his saddle and a length of hemp rope coiled around the horn, and beneath his sheepskin coat, He wore 2 wool shirts and a scarf his wife had wrapped around his neck 3 times before letting him out the door. The cold at that elevation was a thing that pressed against a man's face the way a hand presses against a window pane, steady and impersonal and unrelenting. His breath froze in his beard before it reached his collar. His eyelashes crusted white within the first quarter hour. He reached the flat above the bend a little after 10 in the morning. The sky had cleared to a pale blue so thin it hurt to look at, and the sun struck the snowfield ahead of him with a brightness that made his eyes water inside the narrow slit of his scarf. He pulled the horse up at the edge of the flat and stopped and looked. The Thorn cabin stood before him, half buried in snow. The drifts had piled against the north wall to within a foot of the eaves. The windows on the east side were completely covered. The wood stack beneath the eave had disappeared entirely beneath a wind-carved dune of white, and the chimney rose out of the roof like a small black finger pointed at the sky, cold, dark, giving off no smoke at all. Harlan felt his stomach drop. He had ridden up the ridge preparing himself for one of 2 answers, and he was looking now at what appeared to be the worse of the 2. He swung down from the saddle, tied the horse to the leeward side of the tool shed, and began to break a path toward the cabin door with his shovel. It took him nearly 20 minutes to clear the door enough to open it. The snow had drifted against it in a hard, wind-packed ridge, and he had to chop through the top layer with the edge of the shovel before he could scrape the rest aside. He kept expecting to smell what a man expects to smell when he opens a cold cabin after a killing storm. He kept preparing himself for it. He had smelled it before in his life, twice, and both times it had marked him in a way he had never forgotten. When the door finally swung inward, warm air rolled out of the cabin and hit him in the face like a wave. Harlan Voss stood in the doorway with his shovel in his hand and stared. Inside the cabin, Silas Thorn sat at a small wooden table drinking coffee from a tin cup, wearing only his shirt sleeves and a leather vest. Adeline sat across from him in a wool dress, her stockinged feet tucked beneath her on the bench, working carefully at a slate with a stub of chalk. The dog Josiah lay stretched full length on the warm floorboards beside the hearth, belly up, snoring softly. The hearth itself was cold. No flame burned within it. No coal glowed behind the iron door, and yet the room was warm, not merely above freezing, warm, comfortable. A man could have taken his coat off and sat there in his shirt without a shiver. Silas set his coffee cup down slowly and looked at Harlan in the doorway. "Close the door, Harlan," he said quietly. "You are letting the cold in." Harlan Voss stepped inside. He closed the door behind him with a hand that had begun to tremble, and not from the cold. He stood on the warm floor in his snow-crusted boots, and he looked down at the wood beneath him, and he felt the heat rising through the soles of his feet, steady and even and impossible, and he took his hat off slowly and held it against his chest. "How long has it been since you burned a fire, Silas?" he asked. His voice came out rougher than he had meant it to. Silas glanced at the small brass clock on the shelf above the hearth. "About 16 hours," he said. "I will build the next one at sundown." Harlan looked at the clock. He looked at the cold hearth. He looked at Adeline, who had lifted her head from the slate and was watching him with dark, serious eyes. Then he sat down heavily on the bench beside the door and put his face in his hands. Harlan Voss stayed in the Thorn cabin for nearly 2 hours that morning. He drank a cup of coffee at the small wooden table. He accepted a bowl of oat porridge from Adeline's careful hands. He walked slowly around the room and pressed his palm against the floorboards in half a dozen places, and every place his hand touched, the wood was warm. He knelt beside the hearth and looked into the cold firebox. He examined the small brass draft lever. He asked Silas questions in a quiet voice, the way a man asks questions when he has already understood that he is no longer the one who knows something. Silas answered him plainly. He explained the pits beneath the floor. He explained the stones. He explained the channel that carried the heat of the morning and evening fires beneath the whole length of the room before letting it escape up the chimney. He explained the ash and the shale and the ventilation holes in the planks. He explained all of it the way a man explains the working of a plow to another farmer, without pride, without triumph, only with the careful patience of someone who has been waiting a long time for the right question. When Harlan finally rode back down the ridge that afternoon, he did not stop at his own ranch. He rode straight into Claiborne Bend and tied his horse outside the general store and walked inside without knocking the snow off his boots. Miss Verity Osgood looked up from her counter and saw his face and set her pen down slowly. "They are alive," she said. It was not a question. "They are warm, Verity," Harlan said quietly. "The whole cabin is warm, and the hearth is cold, cold. I put my hand inside the firebox myself." She closed her eyes for a long moment. Then she opened them and reached for her shawl. The story moved through Claiborne Bend the rest of that afternoon and into the following day. Harlan told it at the Broken Wheel. Verity told it at the church. Pastor Crane did not comment when he first heard it, but by the following Sunday, he had found a passage in Proverbs about the wisdom of prudent men and the folly of those who mock what they do not understand, and he preached on it for 40 minutes without once looking at the Thorne family who now sat in the third pew from the back, because Silas Thorne had come down the ridge that Sunday morning for the first time in 9 weeks, and he had brought his daughter with him. By spring, 3 men in the valley had asked Silas Thorne to help them build stone-heated floors into their own cabins. By the following winter, 7 more had asked. He never charged them for the knowledge. He charged only for his labor and the cost of the materials, and he spent the second winter of that new life traveling from cabin to cabin across Sweetwater County, digging pits and fitting shale and teaching men how to gather the dark stones from the creek beds and how to build a hearth low and wide and enclosed. Harlan Voss became his closest friend. The 2 men rode the ridge trail together most Sundays for the rest of their lives, and Harlan never once spoke about the morning he had ridden up expecting to bury his neighbor. Some things a man carries in silence, and some debts a man pays only by the way he lives afterward. Miss Verity Osgood married Silas Thorne in the spring of 1878, in a small ceremony beside the creek where Adeline had once helped her father gather stones. She did not replace Nell Thorne, and she never tried to. She raised Adeline as her own from that spring forward, and when Adeline had children of her own many years later, she taught them what her father had taught her about the way stones remember fire. Silas Thorne lived to be 74 years old. He died in the winter of 1907, in the same cabin he had built with his own hands on the ridge above Claiborne Bend, and the floor beneath his bed was warm on the morning he passed. The cabin still stands today. The stones beneath its floor still hold the heat of the fires his great-grandchildren build in the low iron hearth twice a day, morning and evening, and never in between. Men laughed at him once. The mountain proved him right, and the mountain in the end is the only judge that ever truly matters. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to hit that like button, share it with someone who appreciates tales of quiet perseverance, and let us know in the comments which part moved you most. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of frontier grit, forgotten wisdom, and the ordinary men and women who outlasted the winters that tried to bury them. Until next time.